Johnny Bench was the greatest catcher in Major League Baseball history. Full stop. His 10 consecutive Gold Gloves, his 2 National League MVP awards, his defensive mastery that defined an era, his leadership of the Big Red Machine during the 1970s when that team was absolutely dominant and feared across the entire sport. All of it earned him a place as the absolute, undisputed gold standard at his position. He was not just great. He redefined what it meant to play catcher in the major leagues. His technical skill, his ability to manage a pitching staff, his arm strength, his footwork behind the plate, all of it was legendary. And yet, on July 15th, 2023, even at age 75, even at a Hall of Fame ceremony, surrounded by people who had spent their lives respecting his legacy and acknowledging his greatness, he proved something important and terrible. He proved that legendary status in baseball never guaranteed legendary status in the way you treat people. The story you are about to hear is not about home runs and gold gloves and statistics that will never be forgotten. It is about what he did when nobody was watching. It is about who he was and who he chose to be when the cameras were off and nobody was taking notes. But it is also a story about how trauma shapes us, how success isolates us from accountability, how power corrupts the way we see other people, and how one man's relentless drive for dominance and control left a trail of emotional and psychological damage in his wake. This is not a simple story. It is not a simple villain origin story or a redemption narrative. It is complicated and painful and true. Before we dig into the specifics, if you are into deep dives on sports legends and the real unvarnished truth behind the carefully constructed image, hit that hype feature right now and give this video some hype. It really does help creators like us keep doing this kind of storytelling work, and it takes literally 1 second. Okay, let us get into this. The moment that sparked everything into the national consciousness was deceptively simple. It happened at a Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Cincinnati in the summer of 2023. Gabe Paul, a legendary general manager who had spent his entire career championing minority players in the Latin American and Negro League traditions, was being honored posthumously. Someone had the idea to celebrate his life and his legacy during the ceremony. Pete Rose was telling a story about his early days as a player. He was talking about his first professional contract, which paid him $400 a month. It was peanuts by any standard. Jenny Paul, Gabe's daughter, joked that the amount was cheap. It was a lighthearted moment, a small joke during a ceremony meant to celebrate her father's life and his tremendous contributions to the sport. And then Johnny Bench, sitting right there in the front row in front of everybody, said 4 words that would echo across the internet for days and complicate his legacy forever. He was Jewish. That was it. 4 words. A stereotype dragged out into the open air in front of a room full of people who knew exactly what it meant, exactly what implication he was making. Some people laughed. Most people recoiled. The silence that followed was heavy. The internet erupted within hours. ESPN ran the clip. Every baseball journalist asked for comment. It became the story. By the next morning, Johnny Bench released a formal apology through his publicist. He said he recognized his comment was insensitive. He apologized to Jenny for taking away from her father the full attention and the full respect and the full focus that he deserved during a ceremony meant to honor his life. Now here is the important part. Jenny Paul later said publicly that she did not even hear the comment at that moment. She had not been close enough to catch what he said. She said she did not believe that Johnny Bench had an anti-Semitic bone in his body. She was gracious and forgiving. But her forgiveness did not change what the moment revealed about who Johnny Bench was and who he had always been. This was not a one-time slip. This was not a random mistake by a 75-year-old man who had lost touch with the world and did not understand modern standards anymore. This was a pattern, a lifetime pattern of behavior that goes back decades through his entire life, buried under layers of sporting achievement and celebrity status, and the protected, untouchable status of being a living legend in the sport. To understand how Johnny Bench became the kind of man who would make that joke at that moment, you have to go back to a small, rural town in Oklahoma called Binger. Population, very small. His father was Ted Bench. Ted had played semi-professional baseball, but he never made it to the major leagues. That was his dream, his one big dream, and it died for him. He never got his shot. So when Johnny was born, Ted did what so many ambitious parents do when they themselves have failed to achieve something important. He redirected everything, all of his hope, all of his energy, all of his unfulfilled ambition onto his son. Johnny Bench became the vessel for his father's dream. When Johnny was 3 years old, just 3 years old, Ted put a catcher's mitt in his hands, not as a toy for a 3-year-old to play with, as a career trajectory, as an inevitable destiny already written. Johnny was raised in an environment that was built on labor and competition, and the relentless, unforgiving belief that your value as a human being came entirely from what you could accomplish athletically. His father taught him about labor muscles, physical toughness developed through pulling cotton from fields and loading 100-pound bags of peanuts. That was his childhood. That was how you became strong. That was how you became worthy. The message was clear and unambiguous. Your body is a tool. Your emotions are a distraction that will slow you down. Success is the only thing that matters. Everything else is weakness. This foundation shaped Johnny Bench at the cellular level. He learned young that vulnerability was dangerous, that connection was liability, that the only thing that mattered was winning the next competition, achieving the next goal, proving your worth on the field of play. He learned to shut down the softer parts of himself. Ted Bench served as both the primary coach and the architect of his son's entire career path through childhood and into adulthood. The relationship was defined by Ted's ambition projected relentlessly onto Johnny. The elder Bench viewed his son as the vessel for his own unfulfilled professional dreams. Dreams that had been curtailed by military service, by 2 separate hitches in the Army when he was young. He had missed his window of opportunity, so Johnny became the second chance. Johnny became the redemption narrative. This dynamic placed enormous pressure on Johnny from a very young age. He was not raised to pursue baseball for his own joy or personal passion. He was raised to fulfill his father's dream. The death of Ted Bench in 1990, occurring shortly after Johnny's induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame, represented the loss of his most significant interpersonal anchor. The timing was striking and painful. Johnny had finally achieved the ultimate goal his father had pushed him toward. He had made it to the Hall of Fame, the ultimate validation, and then his father died, just as Johnny was reaching the pinnacle of professional recognition. The death coincided with a period in which Bench's public and private reputation began to face greater scrutiny in the absence of his on-field performance. Without the excuse of being an active player, without the shield of current achievement, his character and his interpersonal style became more visible to the world. And what people increasingly saw was not appealing. Then, on April 1st, 1965, everything changed. The high school baseball team bus was coming home from a game. It was a normal ride home. There was nothing that suggested anything unusual would happen. On a steep decline, on a hill, the brakes failed completely. The bus lost all stopping power. The vehicle plummeted into a 50-foot ravine. It fell, and when it hit the bottom, 2 of Johnny Bench's teammates were dead. 2 young people he knew, who he probably played with, who he probably laughed with, who had their whole lives ahead of them, were gone. Johnny Bench had the reflexes and the physical instinct to survive. He dove to the floor of the bus as it was falling. He pulled someone down with him. He protected someone else with his own body. He lived. His teammates did not. Some people can experience a trauma like that and process it and move forward while still maintaining emotional connection to others. Johnny Bench was not one of those people. From that moment on, according to people who knew him and studied his life, Johnny hardened. Something inside him closed down. He developed what he would later call a fatalistic outlook on life. You start over the next day. You do not think about the past or dwell on it. You do not process the emotional toll. You do not feel. You push the feelings down and you move forward. You focus purely on the requirements of the moment. This defense mechanism, this psychological wall that he built, it made him absolutely perfect at catching. A catcher gets physically battered every single game. You get hit by pitches. You get injured constantly. You have to come back day after day after day and endure more pain. If you think about the pain, if you process it emotionally, you cannot do the job. You have to be numb. Johnny Bench was the master of numbness. But that same emotional numbness that made him an incredible catcher made him a terrible human being. It made him someone who could not access genuine intimacy with other people. It made him someone who viewed relationships through a lens of temporary utility rather than genuine human connection. It made him someone who, when his father died in 1990, just shortly after his Hall of Fame induction, did not have the emotional capacity or the emotional tools to actually grieve the most significant person in his entire life. By 1968, Johnny Bench had arrived in Major League Baseball as the catcher for the Cincinnati Reds. He was young, probably early 20s. He was talented, he had elite-level athleticism, and he was absolutely uncompromising about how things should work, how authority should function, and who was in control in any given situation. He saw himself as the intellectual superior of the pitchers he caught, and he was probably right about that. He understood the game at a deeper, tactical level. He knew what pitches should be thrown in what situations. But his knowledge did not come with empathy, or patience, or grace. Spring training that year, Jim Maloney was on the mound. Maloney was an 8-year veteran, a former power pitcher who had been one of the better arms in the entire league. But injuries were catching up with him. His arm was breaking down from years of use and damage. He had lost significant velocity on his fastball. He was not the same pitcher anymore. Bench kept calling for breaking balls, for curves, for sliders, pitches that did not require the velocity that Maloney no longer had. But Maloney kept shaking off the young catcher. Maloney kept insisting on throwing his fastball. It was all he had left, and he was trying to hold on to it. So Bench walked to the mound, walked out to talk to this veteran pitcher, and told him bluntly that his fastball was not popping anymore. The velocity was gone. It was not effective. Maloney responded with an epithet, an insult, maybe a curse word. He did not appreciate a rookie questioning his ability. He did not appreciate being told he was washed up. And then Bench decided right in that moment that he was going to humiliate this man publicly in front of everybody in spring training. He signaled for a fastball. He told Maloney to throw it. And as the pitch came in toward home plate, Johnny Bench deliberately dropped his catcher's mitt. He removed his glove. He caught the pitch with his bare hand. He caught a fastball with no protection just to prove a point. Just to demonstrate that the pitch was not fast enough to hurt him. The entire field went silent. What Bench had just done was not just confident. It was not even just dominant. It was cruel. It was a calculated public execution of a man's dignity and professional pride in front of his peers and coaches and everybody who mattered. Maloney had to swallow that humiliation. A year later, the two combined for a no-hitter together. They became professionals and performed their jobs. But nobody who witnessed that moment ever forgot what Johnny Bench was willing to do to establish total control, what he was willing to sacrifice in terms of respect and human dignity to prove his authority. Inside the Cincinnati Reds clubhouse during the Big Red Machine era, there was a constant tension, a constant jockeying for position and status. Bench and Pete Rose were the two biggest stars, the two most famous players, the two most recognizable faces of the franchise. But they were nothing alike in personality or style or the way they approached the game. Bench was sophisticated. He had endorsement deals from major companies. He had a carefully curated public image. He was the handsome, articulate, polished face of baseball. Rose was all grit and scrappiness, and playing hard every single day. He was working class. He embodied the hard-nosed ethic of blue-collar baseball. He was a grinder. They were competing for the same role, the same status, the same identity as the alpha dog, the undisputed leader of the Big Red Machine. The tension between them was real and constant. They were never really friends. They were never bosom buddies off the field. Manager Sparky Anderson described their relationship as a tightrope. One wrong step and the whole thing falls apart, and the fragile equilibrium is destroyed. The only person who could smooth out that friction, the only person who had the credibility and the emotional intelligence to keep those two alpha personalities from tearing the entire clubhouse apart, was Tony Perez. When Perez was traded away after the 1976 season, something fundamental broke in the team that they never really fixed. But beyond that, in the absence of Perez and his moderating influence, Bench and Rose remained enemies, rivals, cordial opponents who could play together but never truly trusted each other. By 1989, Rose was facing a gambling scandal. He owed money to gamblers. He was under threat of physical violence. General manager Dick Wagner made the decision to let Rose leave the franchise, to essentially exile him from the only sport and the only identity that had ever truly defined him. And Bench, who was the team leader, who had the power and the standing and the credibility to advocate publicly for Rose, to fight for his teammate, did nothing. He stayed silent. He did not defend Rose. He did not speak up. Years later, when Rose was banned from baseball for life, when his Hall of Fame eligibility was permanently closed off, Bench was vocal. He said publicly that anyone who gambles on baseball should never be allowed in the Hall of Fame. He was right on the principle. The rules matter. Integrity matters. But in the radio war they had in 1995, in their public back and forth, Bench sounded cold. He sounded like someone enforcing rules, rather than someone mourning the loss of a teammate, however complicated that relationship was. He was speaking as an authority enforcer, not as a friend. By the time it was over, Rose had accused Bench of jealousy and of speaking from ignorance. And Bench said he was tired of the whole saga, tired of hearing about Pete Rose, tired of the controversies. He just wanted it to be over. That is who he was fundamentally, not someone who fought to save relationships, not someone who went to bat for his teammates, someone who enforced standards, someone who moved on to the next day without looking back. In 1975, at the absolute height of his fame and athletic dominance, when he was already being discussed as the greatest catcher in baseball history, Johnny Bench married Vicky Chesser. She was a nationally prominent model at the time. She was beautiful, she was accomplished, she had her own career and her own standing in the world. She was at the peak of her modeling career, getting major television commercial jobs, the kind of things that made her a recognizable face. The marriage lasted 13 months. 13 months, and the divorce that followed was not quiet and private. Vicky went public with allegations and testimony that fundamentally challenged and undermined the public image of Johnny Bench as a wholesome American icon, as a good guy, as someone worthy of the hero worship that baseball fans had directed at him. On the wedding night, according to Vicky's testimony, Johnny Bench brought his best man home from the wedding ceremony, and they played ping pong all night. Not for an hour, all night. While she sat there, waiting for her husband to be present, waiting for him to acknowledge her existence, waiting for him to treat her like something other than another obligation or an obstacle to overcome, he was in another room playing ping pong with his buddy. Competitive games, serious games, games that mattered more to him in that moment than being present with his new wife. She said later that Bench had been romantic before the marriage. He had courted her. He had shown signs of being someone capable of genuine emotional connection and romantic gesture. But the second the wedding ceremony was over, the second he had locked down the marriage, the switch flipped. He became someone different, someone who prioritized male companionship and athletic competition over her emotional needs, someone who made her feel completely invisible. The financial dynamics of the marriage were even worse than the emotional dynamics. Bench was making massive money as the superstar catcher of the Cincinnati Reds. Millions of dollars. A fortune. But inside the house, inside his private life, he was cruel with money. He was tight-fisted and controlling. He refused to hire a maid to come one day a week because he said it was too expensive. He said he did not want to waste that money. But when he wanted to gamble, when he wanted to place bets, he would lose $10,000 on a single bet without any hesitation whatsoever, without even thinking about it, without any sense that the money mattered or that it was wasteful. The contradiction was striking. Money was too tight for her health and comfort and dignity, but it was loose when it came to his entertainment and his games. When Vicky got sick, when she developed medical issues, Bench would not let her go to the doctor right away. He made her wait for the Cincinnati Reds team physician to come to town. The free doctor. The one who did not cost him anything. The one who was provided as a benefit to the players. He told her that paying for immediate medical care was wasteful. He said her health was not worth the immediate expense. Just wait for the free option. Over time, the stress of that environment, the neglect, the psychological damage of being married to someone who viewed her as a financial asset rather than as a person, rather as a spouse or a human being, it ruined her. It ruined her health. And as a model, your health and your appearance are everything. They are your entire career. Her career ended. She never returned to the top of her field. She never recovered the status she had before the marriage. When she got an offer to pose for Hustler magazine for $25,000, she was desperate. She was damaged by the marriage. She was trying to salvage something from the wreckage, and Bench told her to take it. He said it was good money. He actively pushed her toward it because the money would be useful to him. He encouraged her to do something that she was ashamed of. When the divorce went public and Vicky's allegations became known to the press and the public, Bench did not defend himself emotionally in any way. He did not engage with the allegations as a human being, trying to explain or justify his behavior. He did not acknowledge her pain. He did not offer any kind of genuine response to the testimony about what he had done. Instead, he treated the entire situation like a hostile business negotiation, like a contract dispute. He said coldly that her claims were motivated by disappointment and anger over the alimony she wanted. He said there was no basis in fact to any of it. He refused to address specific allegations because, he said, it would only hurt her more. That is what he told reporters, that it would hurt her more if he responded. But what it really was control. The same control he had exercised throughout the marriage. The same refusal to acknowledge her humanity, her pain, her existence as anything other than something to be managed and dismissed and shut down. The Cincinnati Reds divorce referee denied her request for approximately $100,000 a year in temporary alimony. She got far less than that, a fraction of what she had asked for. And that was the end of it. Johnny Bench moved on. He moved forward to the next chapter. He moved on as if the previous 13 months had not happened, as if he had not damaged another human being in the pursuit of maintaining his perfect image and his control over his own circumstances. Now, in 1972, at the absolute peak of his powers as a baseball player, when he was winning MVP awards and leading the entire league in home runs and RBIs, Johnny Bench was unstoppable. He was performing at the highest level possible. Then, a routine medical examination revealed a lesion on his lung, a growth that needed investigation. It required immediate surgical intervention. The surgery was significant and invasive. The surgeons had to cut through his ribs. They had to cut through his nerves, the intercostal nerves that run along your ribcage and control the rotational power in your torso. The lesion was ultimately found to be benign. It was not cancer. It did not kill him. But the surgery itself, the cutting and the damage, did something else. It changed him permanently. In interviews for the rest of his life, Bench would say the same thing over and over again. He was never the same player afterward. The physical damage to the intercostal nerves and the disruption of the chest cavity's structural integrity fundamentally altered his swing mechanics and his ability to generate the explosive rotational power that had defined his early career. The 45 home run seasons vanished. His body could still function at a high level. He could still play baseball professionally. He remained a productive player and a defensive master, but the cutting edge was gone, the dominance was diminished, and the pain was constant. The chronic daily pain of catching with damaged nerves, dealing with that every single game, every single practice, every single day of his life. It made him increasingly bitter. Teammates and fans began to note that Bench became increasingly prickly as his career went on. He was in pain all the time. He was frustrated by his declining abilities despite his best efforts. And he was someone who had never learned how to process difficult emotions or physical suffering in healthy ways. The pain and frustration had nowhere to go except outward, into his interactions with the people around him. By the 1990s, as his playing career receded into memory and history, as he transitioned into the role of elder statesman of baseball, a living legend, Bench's reputation had solidified in a particular way. He was acknowledged universally as the gold standard catcher. He was untouchable as a legend. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame. He was respected for his achievements. But fans and reporters and people who encountered him began to describe him using different language. Prickly, rude, dismissive, a bit of a jerk at public appearances. Not warm like other legends. Not accessible. Not the kind of person you wanted to spend time with or grab a beer with after a game. That reputation did not emerge randomly or without reason. It was not just an unfair characterization. It was built on decades of actual behavior patterns. It was built on the ping-pong wedding night when he ignored his new wife and chose competition over intimacy. It was built on telling a sick wife to wait for the free doctor rather than seek immediate care. It was built on humiliating Jim Maloney in front of the entire team to prove a point about authority and dominance. It was built on refusing to fight for Pete Rose, even when he had the power and standing to do so. It was built on treating people in public appearances with coldness and distance, like they were not worthy of his warmth or attention. It was built on a lifetime of choosing rules and standards over relationships, choosing control over genuine connection, choosing his own emotional protection over the humanity of the people around him. It was built on compartmentalizing his feelings and his capacity for empathy because of what he had learned as a child in Oklahoma, what he had reinforced after the bus crash, and what he had perfected and honed as a professional athlete. And then, in 2023, at an age when most people have learned from their mistakes and evolved beyond the insensitivities of their youth, when they have become kinder and more aware and more thoughtful, Johnny Bench made a Jewish stereotype joke at a Hall of Fame ceremony in front of hundreds of people. It was the same pattern that had repeated for 60 years. The horrible truth about Johnny Bench is not that he was secretly a villain or a monster hidden behind a respectable image. It is that he was profoundly shaped and damaged by trauma into someone who could not access his own emotions or genuinely understand the emotions of others. It is that his greatness as a catcher, his emotional stoicism, his tactical dominance, his physical toughness, those exact same qualities that made him legendary, also made him terrible at being a husband, terrible at being a friend, and increasingly tone-deaf as a public figure. The qualities that made him untouchable on the field also isolated him completely. They built walls so high that by the time he was 75 years old, making that joke at that ceremony, he still could not see the damage he had done. He still could not perceive how his words landed on other people. He still operated from the same playbook that had worked for him his entire life. Dominance, control, moving forward without looking back. The bus crash in 1965 hardened him and taught him that emotions were a liability, that dwelling on the past was weakness, that the only way to survive was to numb yourself and push forward. The pushing from his father created an obsession with control and a belief that your value came only from what you accomplished, that if you were not winning, you were failing, that relationships were secondary to achievement. The lung surgery in 1972 made him live with constant chronic pain, which eroded his patience and his capacity to be present with people who needed him. These things are real. These things matter. They explain him, but they do not excuse him. They do not excuse what happened to Vicky Chesser. They do not excuse the humiliation of Jim Maloney. They do not excuse the way he treated people throughout his career. Understanding the roots of his behavior is important. It is crucial, actually, but it does not erase the behavior or its consequences. It does not undo the damage he did to the people around him. Explanation is not the same as exoneration. What makes Johnny Bench worth examining and understanding is precisely this duality. He is the undisputed best to ever play his position. His statistics are generational. His technical mastery was almost robotic in its perfection. His influence on the position of catcher was immense and permanent. No catcher in Major League Baseball has ever dominated the position the way Johnny Bench did. And he is a man whose personal failings tell a story about what isolation does to people at the highest levels of success. What happens when someone is so talented that nobody is willing to challenge them or hold them accountable? What happens when greatness becomes a shield against the consequences of your actions? He lived in a bubble of excellence, where his talent shielded him from the consequences of his interpersonal failures. Nobody was going to bench the greatest catcher in baseball because he was mean to his wife, or because he was arrogant to his teammates. Nobody was going to criticize him publicly when he was winning MVP awards and leading his team to championships. The sport protected him. The system protected him. His status and his achievement protected him. And it left him completely free to keep making the same mistakes over and over again, without ever being forced to truly reckon with what he had done or how he had hurt people, without ever being required to develop the emotional intelligence or the self-awareness that might have allowed him to change, without any real consequence beyond the internal damage to the people he hurt. That is the real tragedy of Johnny Bench. Not that he was a bad person, but that he was a person shaped by trauma, who never had to face the consequences of his actions, never had to do the internal work required to heal or change, and who therefore repeated the same patterns for decades without interruption. He was protected by his talent. He was protected by the sport. He was protected by the era he played in, before social media, before accountability, before the world demanded that its heroes be more than just good at sports. You can respect the legend. You can acknowledge his greatness. You can appreciate what he did for the game and for the sport of baseball. And you can also tell the truth about the damage. You can hold both things at the same time in your mind: the incredible athletic achievement and the personal cruelty, the gold standard catcher and the man who broke his wife's spirit, the Hall of Famer and the guy who made an anti-Semitic joke at a ceremony in 2023. This is the real story. Not the narrative that gets printed in official baseball magazines. Not the curated image presented in endorsement deals and public relations statements. Not the protected legacy of a legend. This is the complicated, messy, painful human truth underneath all of that carefully constructed image. Johnny Bench was great. That is undeniable. And greatness by itself does not make you a good person. Greatness does not excuse your behavior toward others. Greatness does not erase the damage you have done. That is the lesson. That is what his story teaches us. If you have made it this far in the video, you know why this story matters and why this video exists. You understand that this is not just about one baseball player from the 1970s and 80s. This is about how systems protect people who are talented, how fame insulates people from real accountability, how trauma can be passed down and perpetuated through generations without healing, how someone can be great at one thing and absolutely terrible at being a human being, and how the world often chooses to celebrate the greatness while ignoring or excusing the damage. That pattern happens over and over again, in sports, in entertainment, in business, in every area of human achievement. If you want more content like this, more deep dives into the truth behind the legend, more stories about the complicated realities behind the public image, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about Johnny Bench and his legacy. Tell me if you think understanding his trauma excuses his behavior. Tell me if you think he deserves a redemption narrative. And hit that like button. It helps the algorithm understand that you want more of this kind of storytelling. It helps creators like me continue to tell these kinds of stories and bring these truths to light. Share this video. Send it to people who need to hear it. Send it to people who still think Johnny Bench is just a legend and nothing more. Send it to people who need to understand that greatness and goodness are not the same thing, that talent does not excuse cruelty, that being the best at something does not give you permission to be terrible to the people around you. Thanks for watching, and thanks for caring about the truth.